Hello everyone, welcome to my fourth video, I believe. I still need subscribers, I need comments, likes, everything. I want to build this channel, and the more you can help me, the more I can help you. My channel is specifically for people who are very serious about learning Japanese because you want to live in Japan. Maybe you're already living in Japan and you plan to stay here for several years. That said, if you're just learning casually or just for tourism purposes, you can still benefit from my content, but you'll see that my content tends to go very deep into subtle nuances that might not matter if you're just learning casually, because it's not said enough. When you're studying something, learning something, you don't always have to go all the way. In fact, for tourism purposes, maybe 1 year of relatively serious Japanese studies will be enough. Within 1 year, you're not likely to be having deep conversations with friends, but you might be able to buy tickets, order food, understand basic keigo, etc. And that's good enough if you're just a casual learner, if you're just coming for tourism purposes. As I've been repeating many times in my previous videos, which you should watch, especially the first two, one of the biggest difficulties in Japanese learning is how the language actually works, and this is not taught enough at the beginning stages. Eventually, good teachers, not all of them are good teachers, but some of them will touch on this subject, and it's very, very important. And I think it's a subject that needs to be learned from the very beginning, which is why I'm making this video. I don't want to repeat myself too much because you just have to watch my first two videos. They're that important. But just to summarize, whenever I've talked to Japanese friends who are learning, let's say, English or French, whenever I ask them what's the most difficult aspect of learning English or French or whatever language, there are usually two answers. One of them is pronunciation, for obvious reasons, but the other one is they're very, very afraid to sound rude. Because in their language, in the Japanese language, the way you choose your words, depending on the situation, depending on who you're talking to, can appear very, very rude, even if it seems very neutral. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. You may have heard that in Japanese, there are arguably two categories of speech. Casual speech, reserved for your friends or family, and then polite speech. And then, among academics, within the polite speech, you have three broad categories. One is called sonkeigo. So sonkeigo is basically a set of vocabulary that you use when addressing someone who you want to respect, someone who is superior to you, so to speak. So if you're an employee at a company, you talk to the customer this way. You refer to them using words from the sonkeigo vocabulary. Then you have kenjogo, is humble speech. So in the same situation, if you're the employee of a company and you're talking to a customer, whenever you're referring to yourself or people from your company, you are using vocabulary from the kenjogo family, humble speech. And then the next broad category is what we call, I guess, general polite category, the mas form. Mas form, M-A-S-U, like arigatou gozaimasu, that mas. However, the truth is you have many other tiny subcategories. And I think certain academics in Japan have further divided the categories, but most people are not aware of it. And it's not important. It's not relevant to this video. I don't want to get into the academic side of things. But just remember this, there are many, many layers of polite speech, and it's so complex. And get this, you want to see how much more complicated it can get? If a Japanese person really doesn't like someone, instead of outright insulting them, they will use the most high level of polite speech, sonkeigo, and they will use it at its most extreme variant. Because when you use sonkeigo, you are creating distance between you and your partner. When you create this distance, it means I don't want to be close to you ever. And like I said, there are many subcategories of keigo. And if you use the highest form, you're essentially creating so much distance, a huge barrier. So it's almost like a sarcastic way of insulting them. Of course, you can also outright directly insult someone, but it's maybe perhaps a little bit more lower class, maybe. But the art of being mean in Japanese is quite complex, and it has a lot to do with their psychology. It affects their psychology. That's why if you go on Reddit or YouTube, there's so many threads, articles, documentaries from foreigners asking why are Japanese the way they are. A lot of this has to do with the way the language works and how it affects them. There are even videos on YouTube from Japanese people about why I had to leave Japan, why I cannot live in Japan. A lot of this has to do with the culture and how the language affects the culture or vice versa. So in today's video, what I want to do actually is take examples from the JLPT exam. So the JLPT exam is the standardized test for the Japanese language. Now, I do think that studying for the JLPT can be very good. You can learn a lot of vocabulary, a lot of kanji, a lot of grammar. But if you don't understand this concept of how the Japanese language works, it can be slightly dangerous. Because a lot of the examples on the JLPT exam, even though everything is grammatically correct, they have a bit of a textbook feel or an academic or even a robotic feel to it. And copying the example sentences in day-to-day life situation can potentially be very rude depending on the situation. In other words, it's not always natural Japanese. Maybe you guys are familiar with that YouTuber, That Japanese Man Yuta, who's always trying to teach you the correct Japanese. It's very true. That's what he means. Another YouTuber, Japanese Amo no Misa, is also teaching you the correct Japanese. As I've said in a previous video, if you're planning to live in Japan for the long term and you want to develop long-lasting relationships with Japanese people in the Japanese language, you have to be very, very conscious about such things. I have made such mistakes before in the past, using the wrong set of words without doing on purpose. I kind of offended the person I was talking to because I wasn't aware. Grammatically speaking, everything was correct. The meaning was correct, but the way I used the words, it created distance, almost as if I was outright rejecting the friendship of someone. If you're not going to be living in Japan for a long time and you're not going to have long-lasting relationships with Japanese people, okay, they can be very, very forgiving, knowing that you're still studying Japanese or you don't speak Japanese that well. That's totally fine. But for the long-term relationships, it's very important. Because I've seen couples, international couples, where the Japanese person, partner, asks that their partner speak to them in another language because they can't take it anymore. Like the Japanese, even though it's correct, the way the words are chosen, it makes them feel uncomfortable. Keep in mind that the words that they're using are perfectly natural words, neutral words. They're not, the words themselves are not insulting. It's how you use them, in which situation they use them. In that sense, it's unique to the Japanese language because such a concept doesn't really translate to the English or French languages. And this phenomenon is very, very common in Japanese media, like movies, anime, dramas. The whole concept of how people choose to address each other. When you watch a dubbed version of an anime or with subtitles, they usually skip this nuanced aspect because it doesn't translate well to English or French. So, as a learner of Japanese in your studies, I highly suggest that if you have a teacher or multiple teachers even, that would be better, to always ask them, in which situation can I use this sentence? Or explain to them the situation that you're going to find yourself in. Who are you talking to? What was said before? Because it's all about context, or what can be assumed by context. It's very complicated in that way. But then, explain as much as you can to your teacher, and then ask them for the most natural way to approach whatever topic it is that you want to approach. That's how you should approach studying the language. Okay, let's get started. So these sentences, I took them from the JLPT exam. First sentence, すぐに答えてください. すぐに答えてください. The translation is, please answer as soon as you can. And maybe you guys are familiar with the word ください. It's like pretty much please. So it's polite, right? Well, yeah, it is in polite speech. But depending on the situation, depending on who you're talking to, this can be very, very rude. If you're talking to a customer, or even a friend or a stranger, it's so direct. The Japanese people never, well, I would never say never, but it's unlikely that a Japanese will use this sentence as it is. Then where would you use such a sentence? Maybe if you're a teacher in a school, and you can say, すぐに答えてください. But if you say it like that, it sounds a bit bossy and rude. If you want to appear that way, you can use it as a teacher in a classroom, but still sound softer by changing the emotional inflection. So instead of すぐに答えてください, you can say すぐに答えてください. Let's say you're talking to your colleague. Maybe you can say something like this. You can start by apologizing. Apologize. すみません。なるべく早く答えていただけたら嬉しいです. And you try to speak with a little bit of emotion. You see the way I kind of talk like with puppy eyes. Or let's say you're talking to a customer. You can again use a stronger form of apology maybe. 大変申し訳ございません。できるだけ早くお答えていただけたら幸いです. So get this. All three examples, including the one from the JLPT, are keigo. They're all in polite form. But how you use them, in which situation you use them, is what makes the difference. Let's say you're talking to a friend or family member. Using polite form is a little bit strange. I mean, it can be done for like dramatic effect, of course. But with a friend, maybe you might say something like すぐに答えてくれる. So that was casual speech, but there was a hint of politeness with the word くれる. So here's the thing. If you type all of these sentences into Google Translate, you're going to pretty much get the same translation, more or less. So you see the nuance is totally lost. But it's so important in Japanese. Let's move on to another sentence. So consider this conversation. Again, it's taken from the JLPT. A says, 昨日の夜、どうして電話に出なかったんですか? ごめんなさい。お風呂に入っていました. So grammatically speaking, everything is perfect. But it's a bit of a strange sentence because we don't understand the context. What's the relationship between A and B? Because no matter the context, in different parts of the conversation, there are certain aspects that are not natural. Choice of words, choice of grammar. So basically, both of them are using polite form. There's the word どうして, which means why. That is kind of like more of a, how should I say, a slightly more formal way of saying why. So there's a little bit strange. And then, so instead of using must form, they use ですか. That's still polite form. And the person that replies is using mas form. 入っていました. So what's weird about all this is that they're using polite form, but in most Japanese situations, Japanese people don't usually confront people so directly like that. It's considered a bit intrusive and even rude, depending on who you're talking to. The fact that they're using polite speech shows that there's maybe perhaps some level of distance between the two. If we're your family member or your friend, okay, you can be direct. So that's what makes things confusing. So basically, they're using polite form, but they're being direct. And that's kind of contradictory from a cultural perspective. So let's try this scenario. Let's assume that A and B are not so close, but you don't have to use like super formal speech. So A might already start with an apology, even though they were not wrong, but they'll say, すいません、昨晩電話をかけたんですか? So 電話をかけたんですが, and then the sentence is actually incomplete, but Japanese is all about reading the air. So you leave the sentence incomplete. The person, B, will have to assume that, oh, you tried calling me, but I didn't answer. This is very, very typical Japanese. It is used all the time. So for example, you call a restaurant and you want to make a reservation. You can say, こんばんは、予約したいんですけど. So ですけど or ですか, whichever you prefer, they're both the same thing. One is a little bit more formal, but they're both fine. But it's the same thing. I want to make a reservation, but... And then the person will have to assume, oh, okay, you haven't made the reservation and I'm going to help you. Of course, you can also say 予約したいです. I want to make a reservation, period. But it's a little bit cold. By having this incomplete sentence, it softens the approach. It's a little bit less direct. Crazy language, right? Now you understand why Japanese people are so afraid of appearing rude when they speak another language. So let's go back to that previous situation. すいません、昨晩電話をかけたんですが. So then B can reply in a more polite way. あ、そうなんですか。ごめんなさい。お風呂に入ってて出られませんでした. Or to be still polite but a little bit less formal, just a little bit, like 2-3 degrees. Instead of 出られませんでした, you say 出られなかったんです. Crazy. Let's say you're talking to a friend. So you can say, ねえ、昨日さ、電話したんだけど. So this さ, we're not going to talk about it here, but it's just little interjection that you can add to make it a little bit more natural. We're not going to explain it here. But anyway, I used very casual speech here. I still ended with this kind of soft approach with the kedo, but it's in casual form. The full casual form is dakedo. Deskedo is still polite. Desu is even more polite, but maybe like 5 degrees. Yep, it's so subtle. And so A and B are friends, and then B can reply, ごめんね. That ne makes it a little bit softer, friendlier. So ごめんね、お風呂に入ってたの. So casual speech. Notice that I ended the sentence with no. This no is something that you can add in this context to make it a little bit more natural, to explain why you didn't answer the phone call. But again, we're not here to talk about the specifics of grammar. I just want to show you how you change the way you speak depending on the situation. Here's an interesting one. Let's assume now that A and B are a couple. So A can say, 昨日さ、なんで電話出なかったの? So A is being very direct here. And instead of using どうして, they're using なんで, which is the more casual way of saying why. So this is a perfect example of where being direct is perfectly natural. And B can reply, as in the previous example, maybe with more puppy-like eyes. ごめんね、お風呂に入ってたの. But you see, when you're being direct with someone, chances are you're close to that person. And therefore, you wouldn't be using mas form or polite form. You'd be using casual form. Basically, grammatically correct Japanese does not mean natural Japanese. And natural Japanese depends strictly on the situation. So, textbooks or the JLPT exam is full of unnatural sentences like this. Well, they're not necessarily unnatural, it just depends on the situation, right? But it's not talked about enough. And even with licensed Japanese teachers, because when they learn to become Japanese teachers, they're kind of learning from a system, a standardized system, without really thinking about such things, that they teach you unnatural Japanese unwillingly. And then as a student, when you kind of politely confront them about it, they start to realize, oh wait, it's true. I actually never used that. So again, my suggestion, when you're studying Japanese and you have someone that can help you, a Japanese person, always ask them, in which situation can I use this? Or how should I approach this topic in this specific situation? All right, guys, good luck.